Welcome back to the Execution Gap podcast. If you've been following this series, you know where we've been. Episode 3 was about late year charge retrieval, specifically the downstream costs that don't show up in any report until they show up in your HEDIS or STAR score. Episode 4 was about digital data collection, how a digital feed can run very clean, the record can land perfectly, but the gap or the measure still stays open. And that is because the data completeness at the record level and the data completeness at the measure level are two completely different things. Those two episodes were about the individual failure modes that could occur in any of these two streams. Each one isolated, each one painful on its own. Now, this episode is about what happens when you have both digital feed agreements and you also have chart retrieval campaigns running simultaneously, right, at the same time, which, by the way, it's a reality for almost every health plan in this audience right now. I mean, right now, not in the future. Because here's where we are in the industry. As you know, NCQA has mandated full transition away from hybrid measure reporting by MY 2026. As at the time of making this episode on May 11th, 2026, we are in MY 2026, which makes it a 3-year window, right? And during that window, plans are running chart retrieval for the hybrid measures that are still in the traditional reporting, while also operating ECDS for the measures that have fully transitioned, like your colorectal cancer screening, cervical cancer screening, childhood immunization status, IMAs, and so forth and so on. All these are ECDS only right now, and there is no hybrid option for those measures anymore. So if you've submitted them last cycle, you have submitted them digitally. You have 2 data programs, 2 vendor relationships, in some cases, 2 sets of timelines, 2 sets of quality standards, and 1 member population that sits in the middle, completely unaware that there are 2 separate systems that are arguing about them. That maths never works out the way anyone expects. The space between those 2 programs, the overlap, the conflict, the members whose data exists in both streams but satisfies neither completely, that space has a name, and it's called the reconciliation problem. And almost nobody has budgeted for it. That is what we are going to talk about today. Let's get into it. Before I get into the failure modes, I want to define reconciliation precisely, because reconciliation, the word reconciliation in itself gets used loosely, and the looseness is part of the reason why the problem stays hidden. Reconciliation is not deduplication. It is not just identifying that the same member appears in 2 systems. Deduplication is a subset of reconciliation. And honestly, it's the easy part, because if deduplication were the whole problem, we would have solved that years ago. Real reconciliation is this: for a given member on a given measure, you have data arriving from multiple streams, a retrieve chart, CCD feed coming in, lab results, a claims record, and those sources don't usually tell the same story. They overlap in some cases, they contradict in others, and leave gaps that neither source covers completely on its own. So reconciliation is the work of figuring out what is actually true, what is actionable, and what actually gets submitted. That is a governance problem, not a technology problem. And I want to spend a minute on that distinction because it matters more than most plans realize. One thing that is also worth addressing upfront is that NCQA has publicly said they don't anticipate a large performance impact when hybrid methodology goes away. Because at the aggregates level, digital data has been tracking close to hybrid results for most measures. And at the population level, that is true. I'm not disputing that. But NCQA in this context is referring to aggregate rates. I am talking about individual members. And those are two completely different conversations. A plan's overall COL rate may not drop when the ECDS fully replaces hybrid, but the specific members who fall through the gap between two data sources that were never reconciled, those members don't show up in any population level average. They show up as individual unresolved gaps. And those unresolved gaps have names, they have member IDs, they also have star weights attached to them. So when I bring up the conversation of reconciliation in a room full of health plan operators, the first instinct almost instantly or universally is to rate a technology solution. We need better data platform. We need smarter integration layer, more sophisticated matching logic. And look, I build software for a living. So I appreciate that instinct. But here's the reality. Technology can execute a decision, but it cannot make one. So when your chart retrieval vendor's data and your digital feeds vendor's data conflicts on the same member, let's say, for instance, when the chart says a procedure was completed and the CCD feed says there is no corresponding billing on the same member, any system can flag that as a conflict. I mean, in every system worth its price tag should be able to flag that conflict. But what a system cannot do is to tell you which source is right. That requires a decision about which source is authoritative, under what circumstance, and who actually owns that call. That is governance. And governance is not in either vendor's statement of work. I've read a lot of, SOWs in my time. And so we will resolve the epistemological conflict between competing data sources. That never appears in any of them. And this is the first thing nobody budgets for. And this is it. It is the decision-making infrastructure that sits between two vendor programs and determines what happens when they disagree. I want to be specific about what that infrastructure actually requires, because governance can sound vague when it isn't. What you need is a well-documented source hierarchy. And I covered source hierarchies in episode 4. But you need it at a specificity that actually governs behavior at the point of abstraction or data review. Not digital feeds take precedence over chart retrieval as a blanket statement, which is too blunt to be useful. What you actually need is, for this measure, when a lab feed arrives and a retrieve chart conflicts on that same specific data element, the coder, the abstractor, the system follows the same decision-making tree. That level of specificity applied consistently, audited regularly, not by memory. And most plans don't have that. What they have is institutional knowledge held by 2 or 3 experienced abstractors or coders who have been doing HEDIS or stars long enough to know what actually works. And that is genuinely valuable, right? I'm not dismissing that, but the institutional knowledge walks out the door. It doesn't survive turnover. And it's actually what a HEDIS compliance auditor would be looking for when they ask you to demonstrate consistent, documented methodology. Now, let's talk about the budgeting visibility problem, which is why reconciliation work doesn't get fixed. Because reconciliation problem isn't new. Plans have been running hybrid data programs for years. So what I'm describing isn't a mystery or is not a surprise to anyone who has been through a HEDIS season before. But the question is, why does it keep happening year after year? And the answer is simple: structural. It starts with how health plans contract for data services. When a health plan procures chart retrieval, they sign a contract with a vendor. That contract covers a defined scope. It covers the chase list management, reaching out to the provider, chart retrieval, delivery of retrieve charts to the abstraction team, overread, QA, the whole 9 yards. That scope of work has a price tag. It has deliverables. It has SLAs. Everything inside that work is somebody's job, and somebody's held accountable. The same way when a plan procures digital data feeds, whether EMR integrations, CCD exchange agreements, or lab feeds, they sign contracts with different vendors covering different scope of work, whether feed configuration, data normalization, delivery of data to the warehouse, ingest validation. And this work, the same way, also has a price tag. It has deliverables. It has SLAs. Somebody is held accountable to ensure that the work is getting done. But here is what is in neither contract. What happens when a member has a data in both programs, both digital feeds, both chart retrieval, tells two different stories. The chart retrieval vendor delivers what they retrieved, the same way the digital feed vendor delivers what they ingested. The question of what to do when those two deliveries disagrees about the same member will usually land on your internal quality team. Why? Neither vendor budgeted, or it was never considered in the scope of work. Both vendors have done their job. Both will tell you they've done their job, and to their credit, they are correct. And no one has done the job truly. And your internal quality team, which is very typical in every health plan during HEDIS season, internal quality team runs at capacity. So the reconciliation work, which is the unglamorous manual, judgment-intensive work of cross-referencing data streams for members whose records are inherently complex, it gets done at the margin by whoever has spare time, or even after everything else on the list has been attended to. And this is why I say no one explicitly budgets for reconciliation work. You are not going to find it on a vendor's invoice because no single vendor owns this work end to end. You won't see it as a defined line item in the quality operations budget because most health plans have never formally recognized it as a distinct operational function. Instead, the cost shows up indirectly in overtime hours, in delayed submissions, last minute fire drills, heavy reliance on a few key abstractors whose judgment consistently saves the season, even though no one can clearly explain why they outperform everyone else. And every year, usually around February, the health plan relies on institutional muscle memory. The team end up working long hours. They absorb the pressure. They find a way to get through submission. Then March comes. Everyone recovers from the pressure. The operational problem that actually caused the stress are largely forgotten until the next season begins. Here is where the bigger problem starts, because reconciliation is not treated as a formal function. It's rarely budgeted. And because it's not budgeted, it's usually not measured. That means most plans cannot answer the basic questions such as how many compliance records were missed because data was not reconciled correctly, or how many gaps remained open because evidence was never connected to the right member or to the right measure, or how much star performance, how much HEDIS performance was lost due to operational breakdown rather than true care gaps. Instead, leadership sees only the final HEDIS rate and the overall stars outcome. They know the result, but they cannot see exactly where the process failed. And that is the real issue. This is not primarily an analytics problem. It is an operational problem that was never formally recognized, never funded, and therefore never measured. So when something is invisible in the budget, what do you think will happen? It usually remains invisible in reporting, right? In downstream. And what you cannot see, you cannot systematically improve. I want to name a specific population today that I don't hear discussed enough in this space, and it should be. I call them the unresolved members, and every plan has them. An unresolved member is a member where the chart retrieval has partial information about a gap. A digital feed has different partial information about the same gap, and neither sources alone is sufficient enough to close the measure, and nobody has formally reconciled them. So what ends up happening is the member is not in the closed column. They are also not in the active outreach queue. They end up, or they exist in a kind of data purgatory that most quality management systems don't have category for, which is fitting because most reconciliation processes don't have a category for them either. They exist because the two programs that touch them don't share a status layer. The chart retrieval vendor marks the chart as delivered and they close the request. The same way the digital feed vendor marks the record as ingested and they move on. Neither vendor has visibility into what the other vendor delivered. So neither knows that together there are two partial contributions might actually be sufficient enough to close the gap or the measure. I hope you're following. And if only someone will just sit down and reconcile them. What makes this group so important is that these members are not spread evenly across your population. They are concentrated in their hardest to reach or the hardest to close cases, like such as members with multiple chronic conditions, members seeing several providers across different health systems, members whose documentation is scattered across hospitals, specialists, labs, and provider care offices. These are the members most likely to have some evidence in one data source and additional evidence in another, but not enough in any single source to close that gap. They also tend to have the biggest impact on your stars and your HEDIS performance. Why? Because they are often long-standing open gaps that have remained unresolved for multiple years. So when you close one of these members, when you close one of these gaps, you are not just improving your HEDIS or your star performance. You are, in fact, correcting a problem that may have been affecting your trend for years. Here's a simple example, and I need you to follow me here. So you have a member with type 2 diabetes, right? And the member has an open gap for HbA1c. Your lab feed contains an HbA1c result, but the code used for that HbA1c result does not correctly map to the value set required for GSD measure. The result is in the system, but the measure does not close. On the other hand, the chart retrieval team ends up retrieving physician note, right? The note references the HbA1c result, but it does not include the original lab report. And under abstraction rules, that note alone is not acceptable source documentation. So now you have two data sources. The lab feed has the result, but cannot close the measure because the code used does not map correctly to the value set for GSD. You also have the chart that references the result, but it's also not sufficient for audit purposes because it doesn't contain the actual lab result. So the correct next step is to obtain the original lab result in a format that will map correctly to the required value set. But that requires someone to, number one, they need to be able to recognize that both sources contain partial evidence. They need to understand why neither source closed the gap. They also need to request the missing source documentation. That level of reconciliation rarely happens when teams are overloaded and they're also trying to process hundreds of records. So what happens? The member remains open. not because the care was never delivered, not because the data doesn't exist, but because no one connected the evidence that was already there. I want to make an argument and I want to say it plainly and let it land. Your STARS forecast is as good as the historical closure data behind it. And if reconciliation is weak, that history is also distorted. Two things happens. A gap closes after both chart retrieval and digital data touched the member, but you are unable to tell which source actually produced the compliance evidence. So you may be paying two programs when one program would have been enough. The second thing is some members had enough evidence across multiple sources to close the gap, but no one connected the dots. The care happened, the data existed, but the reconciliation never did. So the member stays open. That means your forecast is wrong in both directions. Some closure rates are overstated, and also some opportunities are understated. And you are using that flawed baseline to set target to allocate vendor spend and estimate your end performance. This is not an analytics problem. It is an operational problem hiding inside your forecast. Now, this is the only way to fix it. The only way to fix it is to look back and answer these three questions. Number one, which source actually closed each gap? How often did multiple sources contain overlapping evidence? And the third question is how many open gaps had enough evidence to close but were never reconciled? And until you do that, your forecast is based on assumptions, not on what your operation team is actually truly capable of delivering. All right, let me be direct about what actually solves for data reconciliation. Before I get into it, a word on the market. There are plenty of vendors that ingest HEDIS data, processes CCDs, and supports ECDS reporting and whatnot. What very few address is what happens when two data sources disagrees or when both contains partial evidence but neither closes the gap on its own. That is the reconciliation problem. And solving it takes more than just buying another ingestion platform. Here are three things you need to know to solve for reconciliation, okay? You need to make reconciliation a defined function. Someone must own it, not as a side task, not as a whatever Janet figures out in February thing. It needs to be a formal role with clear accountability for identifying unresolved members, understanding why they remain open, and also coordinating the follow-up needed to close them. Because if no one owns it, it will happen inconsistently. The second thing you also need to do is build a shared member level status layer, meaning your chart retrieval and digital data programs cannot operate in silos. You need one view that shows which source have provided data for each member, what evidence each source contributed, why the gap is still open, what action is needed next. Without this, reconciliation will become a spreadsheet exercise held together by manual work and institutional memory. The third thing you also need to know to solve for reconciliation problem is you need to measure reconciliation yield. What I mean by this is you need to track how many unresolved members were identified, how many were successfully reconciled, and how many closures came from reconciliation work that neither sources would have achieved alone. This is your true return on investment because it tells you how much performance you are gaining by connecting data that was already available. Timing matters because as NCQA moves more measures towards ECDS only reporting, this problem eventually gets simpler because fewer data sources are involved. But during this 3-year window transition period, right, the complexity is actually increasing. They are adding data sources while still running hybrid and chart retrieval programs. It means more data streams, more conflicting evidences, more unresolved members. The plans that build reconciliation capabilities, they will enter ECDS era with cleaner data, better attribution, and more accurate forecasting. On the other hand, the plans that do not will continue to make strategic decisions based on incomplete and misleading information. Here's where I want to leave you. The reconciliation problem has stayed invisible because it lives between programs, between vendors, between budgets. It doesn't have an owner. It doesn't appear on any invoice. It doesn't generate any failed status in any system. So it just quietly produces wrong evidence, wrong answers, wrong outputs, wrong feedback, unresolved members who should have been closed, forecast that was built on data that was never clean. Stars and Hades investments allocated against a baseline that was also never accurate. The question to take back from this episode: pull your open gap list for any given measure where you run both chart retrieval and digital feeds, and ask how many of those members have data in both programs. And then ask, what is the documented protocol for what happens to those members? If the honest answer is somewhere between, well, the team handles it and there is a long pause, that is your reconciliation gap. That is where your star performance is leaking, your HIDIS performance is leaking in a way that no vendor report will surface it for you. This is exactly the problem Prodero Health was built to solve. Not just collecting data, not just abstracting records, but making sure the information coming from chart retrieval and digital feeds or CCD feeds specifically actually works together at the measure level. That means documented reconciliation logic, source level attribution tracking, shared member status visibility, shared audit ready output, and a workflow designed to identify unresolved gaps before submission season. Because the real issue is usually not missing data. It is disconnected data. So if you want to pressure test this against your own environment, start with your actual open gap population and your current vendor setup. This is where these issues become visible very quickly. And if you're interested in a demo or a pilot discussion, the link is in the show notes. If this episode finally gave a name to a problem that your team has been quietly managing, quietly suffering from for years, well, this is an opportunity to share it with the person that is responsible for quality operations at your health plan. They have probably been carrying more reconciliation work than anyone formally recognizes. Episode 6 will be a great one. I promise. See you in the next one.